All right, so I'm going to just talk a little bit more about what my grandpa taught. And in this one, I'm going to describe that. So I think that my grandpa said that there is no formula for the flow. But my grandpa did say that he thought that probably the form of government most conducive to the flow is democracy. And this is where again I was just confused. So but I think I have a better understanding now. But one thing my grandpa taught, like we watched the movie um Forrest Gump, where Forrest Gump runs. He keeps on running. And my grandpa was like, yes, that's what you should be like. Forrest Gump, constantly running, because when you run, that can get you in the flow. You just go all out. You go all out at what you go for, or everything, and then you expand your awareness. You go all out. You all out passion, and that can get you in the flow. And that's another thing that my grandpa told me about, like Jesus. He said that you'd be either hot or cold and not lukewarm, because he said if to be in the flow, if you're cold, like if you're completely bad, then you can get yourself in trouble and you could be more likely to get in the flow. But if you're just medium, you're lukewarm, you're just in conformity, then you may never get in trouble and you may never transcend the self. Now, another thing that my grandpa taught was like we listened to the C.S. Lewis book, and in the C.S. Lewis book, he I forget exactly what happened, but basically, see it. The guy, he kept on getting himself distracted in what my grandpa would call interpersonal consciousness, dualistic software. My grandpa would say, and so he wasn't able to make it to the other side, make it to heaven, right? But heaven, my grandpa would say, is the flow. Um, Now, this is where I started. So I go to live with my grandpa in Washington. This was like 2020. This was right 2019. It was right when COVID hit, like 2020, like right when COVID hit. I stayed with him for 2 weeks. But as I was saying, now this is what kind of confused me, because my grandpa was not a fan of Trump, because my grandpa thought that Trump was more dualistic software. But my grandpa would later recant, and he admitted, he was like, maybe I was too much against Trump, like he was himself expressing dualistic software. But my grandpa thought that Trump expressed dualistic software. Now, I kind of started to like Trump, because I started to become kind of a white supremacist, kind of. Like, I was like, I thought that there was an anti-white agenda, so I was starting to become a white supremacist, and I wanted, so I kind of like Trump in that aspect, because I thought that Trump was more of a white supremacist, and he was helping the white race. I thought that there should be a wall. But I told myself that I wasn't a white supremacist, because I told myself, like, yeah, the wall will help black people, because if there's too many Mexicans, the Mexicans are going to be in the hood killing the black people. I want what's best for everybody. And my grandpa would even say that. My grandpa would say there's no formula for the flow. And like I said, when my grandpa talked about the flow, I would think, is he talking about like everybody should mix and it's like some hippie thing? No, the flow is you discern the truth. So yes, sometimes walls are important. And yes, to try to force everybody to mix, my grandpa would say that's not necessarily the flow. But so I'm listening to my grandpa. I go to Washington, and my grandpa is telling me that he isn't a fan of Tucker Carlson, for instance, right? So I'm thinking, okay, so my grandpa might not be a white supremacist. I was like, maybe he's not a white supremacist. Because my grandpa told me that Tucker Carlson tended to express dualistic software, and he said that when Tucker Carlson would talk, he would furrow his brow. And my grandpa said that that was representative of kind of like dualistic software and being more entrenched within the self, whereas my grandpa said the flow is the transcendence of the self. And again, I asked my grandpa, is white supremacy the flow? And my grandpa said no, because he said when you're in the flow, you transcend the self. Okay. So then I'm asking my grandpa. So I'm talking to my grandpa more. But then I asked him, like, what about the KKK? And my grandpa said, again, there's concessions. So not everything is so, there's sophistications, there's concessions. Not everything's so black and white. So like the KKK, my grandpa said, sometimes there's concessions. And at that time period, there were black people who were raping white women. And it was pretty bad. So the KKK comes, and that's a consequence. And that is to protect people from what my grandpa would say is dualistic software. In that case, predator-prey software. And sometimes those are concessions. So to be like, oh, well, white supremacy is bad. Not necessarily. In that case, my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, sometimes you would discern, okay, there needs to be some sort of consequence to this problem that's occurring of black people raping, all, you know, they just came out of slavery, they don't have any education. I'm trying to like, right now, so there'll be some sort of concession to stop that, to stop the raping. And not just to protect the women, but also to protect the black people from their own the dualistic software that they are expressing. My grandpa would say it's not their dualistic software because they are not their software. So I'm listening to my grandpa. This is when I'm in Washington. And I'm like, okay. I'm trying to understand what he's teaching. And so I'm continuing to study with him. I'm learning. But then me and my grandpa got in an argument because my grandpa's talking about the synergistic anti-entropic eroding function of reality. And my grandpa, because I mentioned this, my grandpa says, Ryan, if you're going to be staying with me here in Washington, you have to get a job. He said, because I'm not going to just enable you, and if you have a job, then you'll be a part of the anti-entropic eroding function. But I tell my grandpa, I'm like, Grandpa, I discovered the theory of everything, the quadrant model. Can you please just help me get the quadrant model out? And I need to focus, I need to study stuff. And my grandpa's like, there's no evidence that you discovered theory of everything, because my grandpa didn't understand the quadrant model. Like I said, my grandpa was like, so what? There's some things that are enforced, but he didn't understand that there is a divine quadrant matrix that's undergirding everything. But like I said, my grandpa was not a big fan of Donald Trump, and he thought that it was an expression of dualistic software and more of a inward like self-protection thing. But again, later my grandpa would say that his antagonism toward Trump was maybe himself expressing dualistic software. So I get in an argument with my grandpa. I'm telling him, Grandpa, I want you to help me to talk to my mom and dad, because my mom and dad hadn't talked to me for 10 years. And I'm like, I want, can you please, and I'm telling him that I think that his like whole independence thing, make Ryan independent thing, has affected me in a negative way because my mom and dad misinterpreted it. And my grandpa admits, he's like, yes, they misinterpreted it. But I was like, but I think that, even my grandpa, I'm like, you also misinterpret. You don't realize I discovered theory of everything. Can you help me, But at the same time, but it is true. My grandpa was right. I was expressing dualistic software, but, I was confused at the time. I didn't understand what my grandpa's teachings were. I didn't understand the flow. Like I said, at the time, he didn't teach me that well. So when he's talking about the flow, I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about some hippie race mixing thing? Or the flow transcend the ego? Is that like some hippie race mixing thing? I didn't understand what he's talking about. So then we get in an argument because I'm like, I want you to help me talk to mom and dad. And my grandpa's like, I don't want to teach you anymore. I'm not going to teach you anymore. So then I'm really upset because I'm like, no, Grandpa, I don't want another couple years of not being taught. If you would just teach me more, then I maybe will break out of my confusion, So we get in an argument, and my grandpa ended up kicking me out of his house in Washington, and he told me he's not going to teach me anymore. So then I went back to Los Angeles, and I'm confused. But at this point, I'm thinking, okay, so my grandpa's not for Trump. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe my grandpa isn't a right-winger. Maybe he is more of a leftist and he's for race mixing. And at the time, like I said, I was still confused. I didn't understand what the flow was. I'm thinking maybe the flow is some sort of race mixing thing. So I became a leftist again. So I was like, so I told myself, okay, so I'll write a based on true story book and try to show my grandpa how smart I am and how much I have transcended dualistic software. Because when my grandpa would talk about transcendent dualistic software, I'm thinking he's talking about race mixing. So I basically wrote a based on true story book, and in the book, so at first I was kind of for Trump, but then I went completely against Trump. So I was expressing dualistic software. But I'm like, Trump is a white supremacist, and I became a leftist again, and I became anti-white again. So I'm saying, like, basically in the book, I tried to argue that Jews. This is one thing that my grandpa taught me. So my grandpa told me that the problem with Jews and gay people is, and this is why I thought he was white supremacist. He says that they tend to identify as that, whereas my grandpa would say there is no thing. And he said, like, gay people, they'll be like, I'm gay, and then they make that their whole identity, and then they never, but my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, you transcend identity. You transcend the self. But my grandpa, like I said later, my grandpa would say, like, he told me that, like Orthodox Jews, he thought that was good because Orthodox Jews, they're practicing their rituals, and stuff, and that can help one to transcend the self. But my grandpa didn't really understand Reform Judaism, why someone would just say that they're a Jew but not practice rituals and not do that type of stuff, because he said that my grandpa would say that rituals take you out of the self so that you can transcend the self to the flow. So, but in this based on true story book, another thing that my grandpa taught me was he told me, like, I asked my grandpa, I said, well, what do you think about the Black Pride stuff? And my grandpa said, well, that could actually be a part of the flow in this aspect. He said, blacks throughout history saw themselves as inferior. So he said that when they have Black Pride, he said, pride, even though it's not the flow, it's closer to the flow than being depressed and thinking of yourself as inferior. Because if you have pride, then that will increase your level of aliveness, and then you can be more susceptible to the flow and losing yourself. So he said it's better, even though it might not be the flow, it's better to have Black Pride. But he said, whereas white pride, that the flow is when you transcend and you're just in inquiry, you transcend. But again, I saw myself as Jewish, and I think that what kind of moved me more to the left wing again too was, like, I was looking online and I was seeing, like, the people say anti-Jewish stuff, like this white woman who had a lot of tattoos. She was saying, like, that the Holocaust wasn't real and all this type of stuff. And I was thinking, like, I want to destroy the white race again. I went back to my anti-white communist ways. So I remember there was that woman, I think it was Eisenhower's daughter, who was saying that she liked Trump and stuff. And I went on her Facebook and I was like, she's a white supremacist. And, how dare you? You're a white supremacist. You like Trump. And I started to go, and also in the back of my mind, I was thinking, if I'm like this, maybe my friends will give me my basketball videos, because I wanted the basketball videos. That's all I really care about is my basketball videos. I want to play basketball. And I want to study the swag flow. But so I went to become a leftist, and I became anti-white again. And basically, so I was arguing, like, that Jews throughout history, they were just scapegoated, and, and black people too. And it's, black people say that they act bad and stuff and they're more criminals, but that's just because of the white people and because of the trauma of slavery. And, and basically I tried to make myself out to be like a black person. Like, I was abused by my family, and, and that's why I suffer now. And same thing with black people, they were abused. And then the abusers want to justify the abuse by saying that they deserve it because they are inferior. And the abused even incorporates those ideas into themselves. And they, what's the word? They like, they appropriate, I don't know the word, but there's a word I'm thinking of, but they appropriate those ideas that they are inferior, and they act them out, and they even do act inferior because they lack education. They've been traumatized, and this is all just trauma. But it's, again, I was just blaming the white person and making the victim the good guy, right? And then when I was looking at the George Floyd and stuff, all that stuff that was happening, I was like, I was anti-religion. So I tried to make George Floyd into Jesus. So I basically was like, George Floyd and Brown, that guy who was killed, and all these, black people who were killed. I was like, they're basically Jesus Christ, they were, Jesus. And because I wanted to undermine Christianity, because I wanted to destroy Christianity, make all the races mix. So I was like, James Brown, or not James Brown, whatever, the Brown, whatever his name was, who was killed. I was like, he was, he's in a society where he was denigrated, and he rapped and he was robbing the store or whatever. But you know what? It's because he's a victim of society. But again, my grandpa would say it's software, but you could upgrade your software. But again, my grandpa would say it's difficult sometimes to upgrade software if you grow up in the hood and stuff. But my grandpa would say it's don't make excuses for having lower levels of software and stuff. But regardless, I was like, I wanted to make him, he's the victim, and really it's the white man's fault. And because, he's just a victim of society, and that's why he was robbing the place, and then he ended up getting killed. But really he's the good guy. And he's just he was basically crucified like Jesus was crucified. Jesus himself, he was considered a bastard, and kind of like the black people who are considered bastards because they were sold to America, and they don't even know where they came from necessarily. So they're like bastards in America, and and basically they're just denigrated, and just like Jesus was denigrated. And then Jesus had this idea that he was Messiah, and a lot of black people tend to express arrogance and believe I was like pointing to the Nation of Islam, where black people be like, we're the gods, and we're the superior, we're the chosen people, we're the true Jews, we're the, we're the original man, and I'm like, yeah, well, they adopt these feelings of, because I was taking my grandpa's idea that, the pride is closer to the flow. So again, I would take my grandpa's good ideas, but then I would incorporate them into my predator-prey dualistic software of trying to destroy the white people. So I'm like, yeah, so the black man, because he's been denigrated so much, he has to lift himself up, and he has to tell himself he's God, and just like Jesus did, because I wanted to destroy Christianity. So I'm just like, Jesus is just basically a black man, especially the white Christianity. So I'm like, Jesus, he just wanted to see, he said he was God because, he had been degraded so much in his life. And so he wanted to uplift himself and say he was God. And it's a defense mechanism because, if you don't feel like you have any power, then if you do this, then you might feel a little bit of power if you're in the power, So basically I just tried to make the black man into like God. And I was basically saying, like, I love the Nation of Islam. And again, it was everything I did was just try to uplift the black man, make the black man supreme, and denigrate the white man. And basically, I was basically like a Nation of Islam follower. Like, the white man's just a caveman, and the black man's the original man. And, and again, I went back to my communist, anti-white ways. But I wrote all this stuff, when I was writing it, I'm trying to be like, I've transcended dualistic software. I'm no longer a white supremacist, and I've transcended. So I tried to get my grandpa to teach me again. So I was showing my grandpa my books, and I'm like, see, look, Grandpa, I've transcended dualistic software. But my grandpa still didn't want to teach me. But my grandma made my grandpa continue teaching me. So, so my grandma basically told my grandpa, Bob, you have to teach Ryan because Ryan wants you to teach him. So even though I wrote this like anti-white communist book, and like I said in the book, I basically I wanted, because in the back of my mind I just wanted to help the Jews, because I always saw the Jews as supreme, So I was like, the Jews are just scapegoats as well, and the Jews are really, but all the bad stuff Jews do is because of the trauma, and it wasn't the Jews' fault that they were made money lenders. It was the white people's fault because they made them money lenders. And my grandpa would say it's a software. It's never anybody's fault, but it's the software's fault. Different levels of dualistic software, and I'll get more to that later. But I wanted to be like, no, it's the white man's fault, and make the Jews the good guys. And I think I was like one of those types of Jewish guys who would be like, the Jews were always got along well with the Arab Muslims. It was only with the Christians, the white Christians, that they had problems with. But again, that was my anti-white type of thing, where I wanted to see the Jews as like the brown people is good and the white people is bad, and I wanted to mix the white people. So. But again, I went back to the dualistic software, and I didn't really understand my grandpa's teachings. What else? But then, like I said, my grandpa started teaching me again, because he wasn't. So I wrote this stuff to try to get my grandpa to teach me again. And also I was thinking, like, in the back of my mind, like, maybe my black friends who have my basketball videos, they'll look at this stuff and they'll give me more videos, DVDs. Because they'll like it because I'm so pro-black, But I showed it to my grandpa. My grandpa didn't want to teach me, but my grandma basically encouraged my grandpa to teach me. And also, yeah. And also in the book, I was basically talking, because like I said, my grandpa would say that welfare doesn't necessarily help the people. But again, I was anti-white, and I wanted welfare. I wanted white people to give to the people of color. So. And basically, I wanted to destroy the white race. So basically, I was just like, there was this book that I read. I forget, or I listened to this audiobook about welfare, and how actually welfare does help people, and people who get welfare and stuff, they don't buy drugs and stuff. But it was written by two brown people, But maybe they had an agenda. But again, my grandpa would say it's not because they're brown; it's because of dualistic software, right? You don't want to blame, But regardless. So I tried to argue that, my grandpa doesn't understand, because I thought my grandpa was white supremacist because he didn't want to give welfare. But like, my grandpa doesn't understand, because I thought that when he's talking about the flow, I'm like, how, if he's talking about transcending the ego and the flow, then yes, you would want to give welfare. You would want to give the people, and it actually does help people. But again, not necessarily. And like my grandpa would say, if you're giving welfare in order to go to heaven, or because even if you're doing it to feel good, that's not the flow, because you're still confirming the self. I'll get more into this later. But But you know, my grandpa doesn't necessarily think that giving welfare or giving people stuff necessarily helps them, and it can hurt them. But at the same time, it's complicated. My grandpa said there's no formula. Sometimes it could help people, but there's no formula. So I'll get more later.